I had always believed that everything in my life was under control. Julia and I had been together for many years, and it seemed like we had been through a lot, experienced both good and bad moments. I thought I knew everything about her, her habits, desires, even the smallest details that others might not notice. We often went to parties, had fun with friends, laughed, danced, and everything seemed perfect. At times, I thought our happiness was unbreakable. But that evening, everything changed. When I approached the group of friends, the overall atmosphere of the party was light and relaxed. Laughter, conversations, music, everything was as usual. But as I glanced around, I suddenly noticed that Julia had stepped off to a corner with Charles. We had all known each other for a long time, and there was nothing strange about them talking. But for some reason, this scene struck me as unfamiliar, subtly tense. I felt like something in the air had shifted. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe I had simply caught sight of this scene at a moment when something random had caught my attention. But for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more between them. I couldn't understand what exactly triggered this feeling, but it was growing, becoming stronger with every passing moment. I kept watching them, but I couldn't figure out how long they had been standing there together or what they were talking about. All I knew was that something was off. I accidentally overheard their conversation while standing aside. I hadn't planned on eavesdropping, but something in their behavior made me pause and pay attention. Charles, usually so cheerful and open, was now speaking to Julia in a quiet, almost intimate voice I had never heard before. This conversation wasn't the usual exchange of phrases between friends, it was filled with something hidden, restrained, yet at the same time, very tense. "You look absolutely stunning," he said, his eyes gliding over her figure, and I noticed how his gaze lingered on her a little longer than usual. "That dress fits you perfectly." Julia was clearly embarrassed, her cheeks reddened slightly, and she quickly stepped back. She glanced around, as if afraid someone might see them. Her face expressed not only embarrassment but also worry, it was visible in every movement she made. "Charles, stop," she replied, her voice nervous, barely holding back the tension. "James is nearby." Charles didn't stop. I noticed how his voice softened, but there was something more insistent in it now, as if he wasn't going to back down. "Oh, come on, he won't even notice. You saw how he ignored you when you walked in, you noticed that too, didn't you?" Julia glanced around again, her eyes darting to the door, as if expecting me to walk in at any moment. But I remained still, not wanting to reveal myself. Julia looked lost, her fingers playing with the hem of her dress as though it helped her cope with the growing tension. She was clearly struggling with something, an inner conflict I couldn't understand. "Charles, please don't," she finally said, her voice firmer, but I could tell she didn't believe her own words. "This isn't what you think." He chuckled softly, but there was no sincerity in his laugh, only calculated pleasure in knowing he was gaining more and more of her attention. "You know I'm right, Julia," he said, his voice full of confidence. "You deserve so much more than just standing by him, watching him ignore you. You deserve more than just being his shadow." Julia didn't respond, but I saw how her eyes began to lose their firmness. She glanced around again, and I felt her shoulders drop slightly. In that moment, she looked uncertain, lost, as though she was tangled in her own feelings. "You're saying that because you think I'm weak," she said, holding her voice back so as not to give herself away. "But I know what I'm doing." Charles took a step closer to her, his words becoming even more certain, almost manipulative. "Weak? No, Julia, you're not weak, you're strong. But you deserve someone who truly values you. Not just anyone, but someone who sees you as more than just the shadow of someone else. You deserve more than this." Julia went silent, and Charles seemed to be getting what he wanted. I stood in the shadows, unable to take a step, knowing that with every word he said, something invisible but vitally important was crumbling between us. These words hit me like a lightning bolt. My heart literally stopped, and everything around me darkened for a moment. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. Julia, with Charles, this was something more than just a friendly conversation. I felt something tighten inside me. The pain was sharp and sudden, like a blow. My world, which had seemed so stable and clear, suddenly became unsteady. Everything I thought I knew was now in question. I couldn't just walk up and ask. I understood that if I did anything now, it would only make things worse. What would I say? How could I explain that I had overheard their conversation? I wasn't ready to confront this moment head-on, but standing here, not knowing what to do, was also impossible. Every glance, every word exchanged between them sent a chill through me. My thoughts tangled, and I didn't know how to proceed. All I felt was growing anxiety, expanding like a snowball. I stood there, frozen, trying to collect my thoughts. Why hadn't I noticed this before? Why hadn't I heard anything suspicious in her words? All these years, when I thought I knew Julia as well as I knew myself, it turned out I was wrong. It felt like a betrayal, not just from her, but from myself. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to see that what I had believed were strong, stable relationships was actually as fragile as glass. I was engulfed by a strange sense of loss. I wasn't prepared to understand that everything that had seemed stable and secure could be destroyed by something so simple and yet so painful. I had always been sure that trust was the foundation of everything. And now that trust was shattered, and I didn't know how to rebuild it. I felt the anxiety growing. What should I do now? How could I live with this knowledge? If I say nothing, it will be silent consent. But if I bring it up, then what? What if I destroy everything we've built? This moment felt irreversible, and I didn't know how to go back to what we had before this conversation. With every moment spent in the shadow of their conversation, I realized I couldn't simply ignore what I had heard. But how to act, when the answer to that question could lead to the destruction of everything I once wanted? I couldn't forget that conversation. It spun in my head like an obsessive melody that wouldn't let go. Every word, every glance, every movement between Julia and Charles now stood before me as though I couldn't escape this memory. I came home late, trying not to show that a storm was raging inside me. I tried to stay calm, to hide my emotions, but the thoughts of what I had heard wouldn't let me be. Those words, that tension, that hidden meaning, everything tormented me. At that moment, I realized I had been deceived. And it wasn't just a misunderstanding. I felt something was happening between them, and it wasn't just flirting or playful conversation. It was something much more serious and hidden. Maybe it had started long ago, or maybe it was only the beginning, but I couldn't ignore it. All evening I tried to find answers, but the more I tried to understand my feelings, the more complicated it became. I didn't know what to do, how to act. I still couldn't believe that Julia, the one with whom I had built my life, could hide something so important from me. Thousands of questions spun in my head, but there were no answers. I asked myself perhaps the most painful ones: why hadn't I noticed this before? Why hadn't I realized that something was wrong? These questions tore at me, and I felt more and more like I was losing control of my life. Evening came, and I decided I needed to talk to Julia. I couldn't live any longer with this burden of uncertainty. I needed to know the truth, even if it was bitter. I couldn't just pretend I hadn't heard what I did. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to prepare myself, no matter how I gathered words in my head, nothing came out. I sat next to her, but the words seemed to stick in my throat. How could I ask such a question? How could I ask about something I could barely believe? Everything seemed so obvious, but I didn't know how to approach it. I tried to start the conversation, but instead of clear phrases, I stumbled over disjointed words. My breathing became quicker, and in my eyes, there must have been a reflection of the discomfort I felt. Julia noticed. She didn't ask directly, but I saw her face pale, and her hands involuntarily clenched into fists. She knew. Maybe she had been expecting this moment, maybe she had a sense that I would figure it out. I tried to focus, but the more I tried to gather myself, the stronger the fear became. Fear of what would be said now. "You're not yourself," she said quietly, her voice soft, but I could sense the alertness in it. "Are you okay?" I didn't respond right away. The silence between us was so thick, it felt tangible. I looked at her, and in her eyes, I saw something more than just anxiety, it looked like fear. "Julia," I began, but the words stuck in my throat. I looked at her and felt the internal tension growing. But she didn't say anything, didn't try to stop me or calm me. She just waited, knowing that this moment was already inevitable. "Did you hear something, James?" Her words almost sounded like an admission, and it became clear to me, she knew I had figured it out. Her voice lacked its usual confident tone. She seemed to be waiting for questions, and I wasn't ready to ask them, not ready to hear the truth. Deep down, I feared that she would admit everything, but if that happened, then what? In that silence, in her question, I suddenly realized, it was impossible for us to go back to the time when everything seemed simple and carefree. The next morning, I couldn't hide what I knew anymore. The whole evening, the entire night, my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. I woke up to them, unsure how to respond to myself. Standing in that shadow was unbearable, and I decided it was time to talk to Julia. I couldn't carry this pain inside any longer. It wasn't just curiosity or jealousy anymore, it was the realization that I had been deceived, and this lie, this betrayal, was draining every ounce of strength from me. I found her in the kitchen, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in her hands. She looked like she was still trying to avoid confronting what was happening between us. Even when she turned to face me, I could see she was trying not to look me in the eyes. "Julia," I said, my voice almost muffled by the tension, "I need you to tell me the truth. Everything." She flinched immediately but didn't respond. She stood silently, staring into her cup as if it could disappear if she looked at it long enough. I took a step forward, forcing myself not to back down. "I know, Julia, I heard your conversation, you and Charles." Her eyes immediately narrowed, and I saw something flash in them, fear. Guilt, maybe even something else I couldn't quite understand. She tried to step back, but it was already too late. "James, it's not what you think," her voice trembled. It was the first thing she had said, but I could feel the words didn't move the situation forward. They sounded like an empty excuse. I began to get frustrated. With every passing second, that feeling grew, like an oncoming wave. I couldn't stand still anymore. I didn't know how to express everything I was feeling. "Not what I think," I repeated, almost clenching my fists to keep myself from exploding. "Is that what you're trying to tell me?" I stood behind the door and listened to you tell him how much it hurt because of me. How you told him that I was ignoring you, and he supported you, Julia. What do you say to that? Julia fell silent, and her face drained of color. She tried to say something, but no words came out. She just stood there, as if all her strength had left her. And I couldn't keep it inside anymore. "You didn't think I'd notice?" I burst out. "You thought I would just sit here and not see anything? How could you so easily disregard everything we had? How could you betray me like this, Julia?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall, didn't allow herself to cry. She tried to speak, but her words tangled, and I saw she didn't know where to begin. She clenched her fingers into fists, as though afraid she might break. "James, I didn't mean to." Her voice cracked, but she quickly fell silent. I didn't want to do this. You don't understand, it was hard, you saw how you ignored me. Charles was there. He supported me. I stepped toward her, and the words came out like a knife. Supported you, so that's what you think, that you should be with him because I didn't do something right. That's what you're telling me now. Julia stepped back, as if I had hit her, and for a moment, I realized that everything I had said, every word, every accusation, wasn't bringing us any closer to a solution. We were as far apart as we had ever been. I didn't want to hurt you, she said almost in a whisper. I never wanted to. I couldn't listen to this. Everything inside me was boiling. Her words seemed empty. I looked at her, trying to understand how all of this could have happened. Where was the moment when everything changed? This isn't just a mistake, Julia, I said, feeling my voice crack with anger. Did you think I wouldn't understand? Did you think you could just hide this from me? She remained silent. I saw how her face twisted with pain and the understanding of what she had already lost. Whatever she said now, it was too late. Everything had changed. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. I couldn't live with this anymore. We couldn't go back to that simple life we had before. I couldn't forgive her, and I didn't know how to live with this truth. You've ruined everything, I said in the silence, looking her in the eyes. You've ruined everything we built. And now I don't know what to do next. A terrible silence hung between us. I left the house. Julia stayed there, in our home, which now seemed foreign to me. Her words, her attempts to justify herself, everything she said lost all meaning. I couldn't listen anymore. I didn't want to understand. She approached me as I was about to leave, her eyes filled with tears, and tried to say something. But I simply turned and stepped toward the door. James, please, listen to me. Her voice trembled with desperation, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay. I had to leave, because if I stayed, I simply wouldn't be able to bear it. I didn't know what I felt anymore. Anger, disappointment, or an emptiness that couldn't be filled with anything. I wasn't ready to hear her explanations because I understood. There was no point in those words. I knew the truth, and nothing could change what had happened. You've betrayed me, Julia, I said, without turning around, my lips pressed tight. Don't try to explain why it happened. I can't be with you anymore. You've broken everything I valued. Everything I thought was important. We're not going back. I opened the door and left. Behind me was only silence and her tears, but I couldn't allow myself to turn back. It was cold outside. I walked down the empty streets, trying to process everything that had happened. My mind was in a fog. I still couldn't understand how this happened. We had been together for so many years, and I hadn't noticed how everything started to fall apart. It was terrifying to realize that the world I had built was as fragile as a house of cards, and one wrong move, and it collapsed. At some point, I understood that this wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't some mistake or temporary weakness. It was betrayal. It wasn't just a physical affair, it was much deeper, the loss of trust built over years. And I knew it couldn't be restored. You can't just regain trust. It's destroyed forever, and in its place, only empty, painful memories remain. My heart tightened as I thought about how much I loved her, how much I trusted her. All those feelings now seemed fake. I tried to justify her in my mind, but every time I remembered their conversation, saw how she avoided my gaze, how she shifted her posture, it hurt even more. I realized that the love I thought was real was just an illusion. Walking past familiar places, I suddenly understood that they would never be the same. I had changed. I wasn't the person who was willing to forgive, to overlook mistakes, to hope for the best anymore. I had learned the cruel truth. Sometimes, the people you love can betray you in the harshest way. And no matter how much you want to understand their motives or justify them, this rupture, this betrayal, stays with you. All that was left for me now was to learn to live with this pain that wouldn't go away. I knew I would move forward, but this experience would leave a mark. It would change me. I would remember that trust is fragile, and I would never look at people the same way again. All I could do now was move on live, despite what I had lost.